All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jewel Alderson-Clark. I am with the San Diego County Office of Education, and I'm the Integrated Curriculum Coordinator, which is just a fancy way for saying I can work on any projects that connect learning to the real world, right? Integrating our learning. And so mostly CTE and some innovation initiatives throughout the San Diego region. And so today, we are going to jump into assessment strategies for distance learning and CTE. I have to admit, I am not in the classroom. As an administrator, I know that at the end of the day, you all are becoming the experts in this, so I really invite you to be part of the conversation. But I do have that, well, I'm not sure I have lots of time, but I don't have students, so I have been able to take some time to research this. And so you'll find the last 3 slides have a ridiculous amount of resources. So if you want to dive deeper into this work or see some of the original content that helped me develop this presentation, you can jump in there. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm going to repost this link in the chat, and let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I wanted to start out kind of by setting the foundation for the work that we're doing. And so the first thing I want to say is do no harm. Assessment is a word that so often incites fear into both educators and students. And what we want to really do is say that it's not about a high risk, high stakes moment in your life where you better tell us everything that you ever heard and everything you ever learned. But really, this is an opportunity for our students to showcase their learning, an opportunity for our students to celebrate the information they know and how they can apply it to the world around them. And so as we get into assessment strategies, it's important to also reflect on every assessment we do. Is this doing more good than harm? A lot of times, and one of the things I have here is don't over or under assess. You know, if you feel like you're kind of giving a quiz every day, almost like an exit ticket that feels really high stakes to students, that might be a little too much and really anxiety inducing, right? So how do we step back and think about all of the assessments we give our students and not only rethink assessment, but rethink what assessment looks like. And so we'll be looking at ways that we can kind of sneak it into their learning, like vegetables into pasta or whatever it is you might do to get your kids to eat more veggies. But what you have to find out is that almost everything our students do is we can assess. The question just becomes, what are we going to do with that information? So along those lines, I think one of the things that people are so afraid of is when they don't know what's expected of them. And so we'll talk a lot today about setting those clear expectations, building rubrics, and ensuring that the process is really transparent. We want you to think about and know what you're assessing and align it to learning outcomes, and really think about how we're narrowing what those outcomes look like and taking them and making them a little bit more bite-sized when we're in a virtual learning environment. Also, we'll talk about the different purposes of assessment. Why are you assessing, and what are you going to do with the information? So if you're assessing, but you're not really going to do much with the information, that's another moment to rethink, like, is this an assessment that needs to happen? Again, don't over or under assess. We want to balance. We want our students to know where they are in the process, but not feel like every day is high stakes. And we're going to spend some time looking at how we can shift towards more authentic summative assessment experiences. And what I say is that can't be Googled, because right now, one of the concerns with distance learning is that our students have access to the whole internet because they're sitting there. They may or may not be on screen. And even if you have limitations on the device they're working on, they may have, you know, like all kinds of other devices in front of them that they can use to do research. At the end of the day, everything that I'm presenting to you today is something that is Googleable in some sense, right? But the ability to apply that knowledge, the ability to kind of rehash that knowledge and put it in a new situation, those are things that you can't straight Google. So we want our students to be empowered to take all the little things they can Google, synthesize them, and be able to talk about them or apply them and all these things, right? So it's really a shift, which in CTE, we haven't been as dependent on those multiple choice tests forever, but also how do we really look at how we're meaningfully assigning and assessing our students. So that's kind of my mini preview and overview. And I know a few more people have popped in, so I'm going to go ahead and post the link to the slides yet again, because if you haven't been using Zoom as much as I have, you know that you only get the things in the chat from when you started. And if you're watching this later, I'll make sure that in the YouTube that the link to the slides is also in the description. So take a look for that if you are joining us later as an archive. All right. So before we get deeply into assessment, it's really important that we all have the same idea about what it is. And so this is really just gathering evidence of student learning, and this informs educational decisions. This could be anything students make, anything they say, anything they do, anything they write, anything they create, to demonstrate the understanding of the intended learning. Notice nowhere on this page says it's something that we give a grade to. Grades are an important part of assessment, but they are not the only purpose of an assessment. So let's take a look, because really assessment is this bridge between teaching and learning. You know that we can talk until we are blue in the face, and it doesn't mean the students actually learned the things that we've said or the things that we've asked them to do. Assessment tells us whether what happened in the classroom has produced the learning we intended, right? So we have to be really thoughtful about the difference between what I tell people and what the people say. So just like right now, you're all in this webinar, and I'm hopeful that at the end you feel like you can apply your learning as well. So when we look at assessment, there's two main purposes, and we hear these terms thrown around all the time, but they're really often thrown around inaccurately. So formative assessment is just the use of an assessment to formulate what you're going to do next, or for the student to formulate what they're going to do next. Summative just means that this is a current level of achievement, and that's often what we put in the grade book is a summative assessment. Here's a pop quiz for you all, and I hope that you'll join me in the chat. What is an example of an assessment that is not formative, and why? So as you think about the answer to this, and hopefully some of you are chatting it up, think about these two purposes of assessment, all right? So to provide information about student learning minute by minute, day by day, and week to week, so that you adapt instruction to meet students' needs and secure progress, right? So thank you, Diane. She says a unit test that is an autopsy afterwards, not to guide instruction, and of course unit exam. Oftentimes those are summative and not formative. My question to you is, could you use them as formative assessments? Have you ever had an exam that you look at the data? First of all, hopefully you are looking at the data after each exam, not just the grade, but thinking about aligning each one of the questions to different standards or outcomes and going like, wow, all the kids got this one right, but man, there's one question that everyone really struggled with. And so even those summative assessments, like an end of course exam or an end of unit exam, may be something that you use to formulate and spiral back and say like, wow, I actually not only need to use this as summative, but also to form what I'm going to do next, right? And so, yes, and I also, you know, someone saying, at least it changes how you instruct the next group as well. So that could be for the following year. I wonder if anyone can think of an example. Basically, what is a test that we never even see the results of? And so if we think about a test that we don't see results of, these are tests like a lot of times the state testing, we don't see them until months later, and we may not have student by student data on some of them, or we might not have, we're never having those students again, right? So we cannot help form what we do next with those students. Things like final exams, particularly in the second semester, or your capstone exams, right? Those are summative assessments. Certifications, those are summative assessments. We can't do anything with that data. Many of the assessments we give can be both formative and summative. And so I encourage you to really think about how you're using that data, and we'll look at that a little bit later as well. So thank you for, and this is an example, what I just did is actually an example of a formative assessment. So this little pop quiz, it wasn't graded, nobody had to see anything. And so I can see in the chat, the comments that you're making tell me that you have an understanding of this, right? Esteban just said, we don't see how students do on certification exams other than if they passed or failed, but not area they're weak in. How do you formulate your teaching around one single numbered answer on a test? And so that's why it's really important when you design your tests, which we're actually not going to talk that much about tests today because those are some of the least authentic experiences that we can provide for our students. But if we don't look at the data that results from our assessments, then it's, you question like, what is the purpose of the assessment? And you have to go back to that first question I said, do no harm. So it's really important that we're using the data from our assessments to inform our teaching. So when we get into assessment more deeply, there are 3 questions that are the key foundation to assessment. Where am I going? Where am I now? And where to next? So as we get into this, this is us being clear. Where am I going as a student? So you have to be clear to them, what is the objective of this? Where am I now? That is our formative assessment process, that checking for understanding and seeing where they are. Where to next? That's going to be where they're headed. And so it could be that we're coming back around to reteach things, or that they've met competency and they can move on, right? So these are the 3 main pieces of our formative assessment process. So I'm going to start out with clarify intended learning, and we're going to look a little bit around what that looks like. So the question becomes, what knowledge, skill, or standards are students working towards mastery of? What evidence do you need that they've met that standard? And that's really important, I think. If you can think about what it looks like to meet the standard and articulate that to students, that's really essential in this work. And then show students examples and exemplars to model expectations and guide their work. What's the difference between an example and an exemplar? An exemplar is like, this is the primo supremo, the best thing you can do. Sometimes you might have student examples that you could say like, well, this student met this particular component, but over here, they struggled on X, Y, or Z. And so sometimes you can use an example to show not only, you know, what the product might look like, but also to show like it doesn't have to be perfect to meet the requirements, or it could be also about growth. So let's start and look at, I've been talking a lot in all of the work that I've been doing with CTE about non-negotiable learning outcomes. This is how you distill your entire class into kind of the basic building blocks of whatever it is you teach. We know that students have a lot of learning loss because from March to June, many students did not engage in meaningful learning experiences. They may not have shown up at all. Some of them showed up and didn't do any work. And some students did do work. So there's a real huge amount of difference between what our students come to us this year versus any previous year, what they might have come to. So that means we're doing a lot of reteaching from the beginning. We also have fewer instructional minutes required, and with technology, sometimes we can work out ways to leverage those for more, but oftentimes, because it is really exhausting to be on Zoom 24/7, it is also important to not overwhelm our students, right? So we may end up teaching less this year than in previous years. So make sure that you look at the year-long outcomes that you really need as the foundation. That's where your focus is. Once you put that in front of them, here's your expectation, your learning target. I know historically a lot of times the district says, put all these learning targets on your board and you just kind of write something random to meet the administrative requirement of that. But really be thoughtful about, as a student, like helping them have that map. Where am I going? That's the question we're answering. So be clear to your students. Don't forget to invite them to the process as well. As you grapple with how to assess their learning, you might open the door and say, hey, here's a standard. Does anyone have any idea of how you could show that you know what you're doing when it comes to this work? And it could be really exciting to see what students come up with. But at the foundation of all of this is rubrics. Rubrics go hand in hand with instruction and assessment. And so developing that high quality rubric is not just a key to the assessment piece of the puzzle, but it's actually the foundational key to instruction itself. It clarifies, here's what we need to learn, here's where we need to go. It almost makes up your learning targets, and the result of the entire project, activity, whatever it is that the rubric is for, becomes the assessment, right? It's all embedded. So let's talk about the life-changing magic of a well-written rubric. You know, this is exciting. You've got to throw some silly terms out. But if you have a rubric, the rubric is actually what guides the tasks that students are going to do. It's going to result in student work, and that becomes an iterative process where they can come back to the rubric, evaluate their work, go back to the task, and do the work. So they can go around in a circle. Once they're ready for feedback, they can come to the teacher, come to each other for peer support, and they can use that rubric as a guiding factor for feedback and to go forward with that project. When we're thinking about how we're going to assess our students, it's really important that we think like an assessor, not just an activity designer. As teachers, it's like, yay, tomorrow's another activity. I want to do fun things with my students. And 100% we want to have a good time with our students and do engaging activities and things like that. But we don't want to just think about what's a fun and interesting activity, but what would be evidence of understanding? How do I get to that evidence of understanding? If you've ever done a really fun thing with students, and then at the end you ask one of them, oh, what did you just see happen? And they can't actually articulate what it is that happened, like according to your standards, they might just regurgitate their observations, you might have missed the mark. So it's also really important to think about, like, what do you want your students to respond to at the end? Oh, and I have a question about rubrics during in-class is easy to use, fast, and can provide immediate feedback. Electronic version. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just put it in something like Google Drive so that students can see it. And I like to have multiple columns on my rubric sometimes, one for the student to respond, one for the teacher to respond for a draft, and then one for a final. And so that's something, and I'll pull up an example actually of some essential skills rubrics that I've been working on with our local workforce investment board in a little bit. And so that might help to show also what a 1-point rubric looks like and how that will help. So let me think about how to pull that in. But all right, so sufficient or revealing evidence of understanding. Given the goals, what are the tasks students need to do? So basically, instead of saying like, here's a project and a topic, it's more like, what are the goals of this standard and how's that going to push the project forward, if that makes sense? We want to really be thoughtful about evidence, right? Evidence of learning, evidence required by results. What criteria will we consider their work and assess levels of quality, right? That is part of our rubric deeply, is that criteria. And, ooh, and I have a question about 1 point in different levels of rubric. So I think we'll get to that in just a second. And then did the assessments reveal and distinguish those who really understood from those who only seemed to? If you've ever asked a question on a test and all the students have a really surface answer to it, and you were really hoping for something that was deeper, a lot of times that is about our instruction and how we've helped students get to that point of understanding, right? And so we also want to make sure that if, you know, for instance, if you just make a checklist rubric, the students don't know what quality you're looking for. And so when we think about rubrics, it's not a checklist, right? We want them to know where we're going, but a description of quality, not quantity. So if I had a checklist and I said, you need to have at least 3 references on your project, how many references are they usually going to have? 3, maybe 4, maybe 5. At the end of this, I have like, I don't know, 20 probably references. Why? Because I just kept digging in until I found all of the things that seemed exciting to me. And so don't limit your students by putting numbers in rubric. Make sure that they see that's high quality that you're looking for. Explain the standards for the work in a manner that students can understand and internalize. And so you might get student feedback on the rubric before it becomes the official rubric. So, hey, students, next week we're going to start a project. I'd like to use a rubric. This is my first draft. I'd love to get your feedback on if you understand what I'm asking you for. I bet some kids are going to give you really thoughtful feedback. I don't really understand what this means. And then you can either adjust it or provide examples so that they know it better. This can be used for self-assessment, peer assessment, and feedback. And it's more than just like directions in a little box. Like in order to do this project, you must blah, 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 but it should have quality. I'm going to take a moment and pivot because you all have these great questions. And I'm going to pull up these essential skills rubrics. Now, this is actually in public comment form, so I'm going to go ahead and drop these in the chat if you want to see them. And I'll open these up and I'll just kind of share with you. I didn't put them in the slide, so I'll drop them in there as well. But this is something that we've been working on. This is what's called a 1-point rubric. So here, what we've done is we have included basically on the areas for growth column, this is where you'd put places that they're not meeting the criteria. So this is things that they still need to work on. Evidence of meeting or exceeding the criteria there on the right, that's where you're going to say, oh yeah, they were able to do this. And you can actually put, you can make links to things that they've done. You can put things in here that are specific so that you can see here, this is emotional intelligence. We have criteria down the middle. Now, you don't want it to be overly huge because it's really overwhelming. So although you'll see that there's a rubric for each one of these, I would never in a million years give all of these to students at once. This is the kind of thing that you say, well, for this project, we're going to focus on this essential skill and we're going to pick one of them. And that's going to be a piece of the puzzle that we evaluate for you, right? So things like here, dependability takes initiative to identify and complete tasks. Here, under areas for growth, you might be able to say, you know, that this student needed additional time because they didn't work on their work the week that it was assigned, right? Evidence of meeting or exceeding criteria might be that the student had a checklist that they followed around the tasks that they needed to complete for the project. So you can actually put evidence in these. Even better, have your students self-score because they're the ones who know what it is. And then you can have a meeting with those students or they can turn this in, and only for students that you don't feel like they know what they did, do you even need to have a one-on-one check-in about their rubric. And so this is a great place where you can do, you know, 2 colors or something like that. Also, if you drop something like this into a Google Doc, you can type, the student can type, you can go back and see each person and when they typed and how. And so, you know, for talking about transferring to a paper rubric, Google Docs is exactly the same as using paper in this case, as long as you have it in digital format and not in a PDF form, or you can change it to a fillable PDF. So anywhere that you can have students type or X, just like they would have written on a paper rubric, it will work the same online. Feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go. I'm just kind of jamming along, and that 1-point rubric question came up, and so I wanted to make sure I was sharing that with you. Let me also grab, I know a few more people have joined us, so I'm going to put this in the chat again. So if you'd like to follow along, come on through, and I will add the rubric example later. So let me go back to presentation mode. All right, so Jim Popham has a ton of great resources on what's wrong and right with rubrics. So if you want to dig deeper into rubrics, by all means, run down that rabbit hole. A few highlights from his work include things like only like 3 to 5 criteria max. So like that middle column, if you just have 3 to 5 things, think about what is most important for your students at any given checkpoint, right? So you don't have to grade the whole rubric every time. If you're doing a couple of weeks, particularly right now in distance learning, where we're trying to chunk information week by week a little bit more so that students tangibly can manage their time, since time management is definitely one of those things that's harder at a distance. What you can do is say like, okay, this Friday, we're all gonna go through and self-evaluate these 5 parts of the rubric on the project that we're working on. So really think about how you can use a rubric for gradual progress towards your final assessment, right? So that rubric might push you through the entire thing. If we look at what's project-based learning, we look at project-based learning, that's learning that has a project that's throughout. So a really nicely designed rubric can draw students through and they're meeting criteria as they go through the learning process. And at the end, that summative piece is there. So often we see that you wait until you've done all of the teaching and learning, and then you have those dessert projects. And that's where you kind of get into this place where they're not applying applying what they know as they learn it. And so really having a rubric preset before you get into a unit, and then being thoughtful of like, okay, each week we want to hit these components of the rubric and build out our project towards that, could really help your students with their time management, help you know what you're evaluating, why and when. And once again, we start with that importance of being really clear with our students on what we want them to learn. All right, when we are creating a rubric, start with the standard skills and knowledge that you want to assess. Pretend you're a student in your classroom. Like, think about what you are, like, what is the example that you want to be made, but also what would a student who wants to do the least possible effort do with that particular piece of the rubric? So if you start seeing like, okay, well, a student, if I ask a student to do, 3 paragraphs, well, maybe they're only 2-sentence paragraphs, they're really low quality, there's spelling errors, right? All of these things that by saying you need to do 2 paragraphs, you have certain students who will see that and go like, well, I can check that box and I barely have to do anything, right? So expand on that, and it's basically, you're almost like your own hacker. So in technology, they actually have people who are called ethical hackers. And ethical hackers, their entire job is like, they're maybe hired by a bank and their whole job is to try to hack into that bank's network using any means possible, because then the bank can find all of the shortcomings of their security system, because they have someone from the inside who's trying to hack in. This is the same thing for you. So you want to be your own ethical hacker. So you want to look at your rubric and start hacking away at it. Like, where are the holes? Where are the things that students, either it's not clear enough, or a student who is looking for shortcuts is going to take advantage of this because it's not explicit enough. So think about that when you're creating your rubrics. Use language again about quality, not quantity, and use levels, not numbers. And so that levels, not numbers, I think this goes back to a question I think Diane mentioned about 1-point rubrics versus different levels. Instead of doing a rubric that's 1, 2, 3, 4, a lot of times you can use columns that are sorry, now I'm putting myself on the spot. Maybe like advanced knowledge, meets standards, approaching the standards, right? We hear some of that language already in other things that we do. Great, nearly meets, proficient, right? We can use these kinds of titles instead of a 1, 2, 3, or 4, because sometimes that 1, 2, 3, or 4 gets really confusing. Like if a 1 is did none of the things, do they really get 1 point for that? What's 1 point mean? If there are 3 on everything, does that mean they have a C because they're 75%? Or does it mean that they have a B because they're just barely away from the perfect, right? So be really thoughtful, not only about how you put that up there, but also about how you're going to grade. Do different criteria have different values to your class or to the standards? And also think about how often you are evaluating a single standard. So if you find yourself evaluating the same standard 3 or 4 times, consider editing your rubric so that you're really like, this is how I'm going to evaluate this standard, that standard, and the other standard, so that at the end of the day, you are not over testing your students. All right, so that was really about being clear. Now let's talk about how we check for understanding. How do you know where students are in their learning? And how do you act on formative assessment information to adjust instruction and learning to meet needs of students? So let's kind of come back to the cycle we talked about at the beginning, right? So we talked about where am I going? That is all about rubrics and also about teacher and instruction, right? Where am I now? This is the formative assessment side of things. And then we'll get to the where to next and what do we do with that after. So here is kind of another iteration of those same questions in a more simple fashion. Where am I going? Where am I now? How do I close the gap? Because ultimately that's our goal in education, is to help close the gap between where students are now and where we want them to be. So let's go ahead, and what I wanted to do is just jump into the first thing is like, how are you gathering this information? Here are some ed tech tools for assessment. Probably wrong, definitely incomplete, right, is the statement people make. So as we go through, you might be able to say that there are synchronous opportunities for Flipgrid and asynchronous opportunities for Kahoot, even though I haven't put a mark there. But I think a lot of times we hear about all of these and we don't use them. I've been hearing about Edpuzzle forever, and finally last week I opened up that program and checked it out, and it was great. Basically, you can pull in any video, and as the students are watching the video, you can put little pause points where there's a question they have to respond to. So, you know, sometimes we're like, well, teachers shouldn't be using movies in the classroom or a lot of videos. Well, they're great if you pause and ask them about the video in the middle or make them apply their learning as they go. And so Edpuzzle is a great way to do that. Everything that I put has free or freemium, right, option. So here's a few. One of my favorite uses of Google Docs actually is that you can give real-time feedback. So if you have students who are working on something, for instance, when I do project-based learning institutes with teachers, so I'll put it on my professional learning hat. Well, they're working in their individual documents. I like to have a link to each document, and I can pop in, read what they're doing, and add little comments. Look, ooh, did you think about this? What about this over here? And so that's a great way to do that. You can also then open the history on any document. So if a group is working together, you can look and see which students have been contributing and what they've contributed to that document. So these are great ways for you to kind of assess what's happening in the students, where are they right now, and also give them that immediate actionable feedback. Ooh, I love it. So Esteban shares that the transportation teachers in Grossmont used Edpuzzle to conduct their safety test. So I can only imagine, like, wouldn't there be a cool spot where there's some crazy scenario and then the question is like, what did they do wrong? And now your students have to share what they did wrong in that safety scenario, whatever it is. So,
if you mind if I speak on that a second?
Yeah, please do. Jump in here.
Yeah, so what they did is, so one teacher's at Grossmont, one's at Monte Vista, and they went and they recorded at the Monte Vista shop, and they went over each, like, so it's a 45-minute video, but it's not intended to watch like all through at once. And so they're breaking it down. So one is like lift safety, and they would actually show them, you know, how to operate the lift, the safety considerations in the event. So now that we're going to be back to level 2, kids are going to already have exposure to that once they get in 1 day a week in the shop.
That's fantastic. So that's perfect. And I like that idea of using it also as an assessment of students are going to be ready when they get back in-person learning to jump into those activities so that you can have, you know, kind of also proof. Someone mentions permission slips about Edpuzzle. So you always want to work with your own legal department around what is best for students. So if your district does not already have an account and an MOU with any given platform, then putting student information in it can be problematic. And so, yeah, Esteban is saying that they have a partnership with Edpuzzle. Usually it's like a simple MOU. It's part of the contract when you contract services. You also could have permission slips from parents that are just generic in some districts around use of different platforms. You know, when I was in the classroom, I maybe did not always know that these were the things, but now that I'm at the administrator level, I understand how important student personal data is. And just like if you had a Facebook account and you were worried when there were breaches of data, that's why we worry about having, let's say you put all your students' information in Edpuzzle and they have some kind of a data breach. Now, who tells the parents and all of that stuff? So that is all about talking to your legal department also. All right, so here's a couple of other EdTech tools for assessment. We're going to use Padlet here in a moment as a group, and then there's a number of others. I haven't been playing with Pear Deck as much as I did in person. Pear Deck has been amazing for doing things at conferences, but what I've heard is one of the things Pear Deck implemented is that you can actually kind of have like a little dashboard where you can see students working on their own devices on a problem, but students can't see each other's work. So it was something that was used in math classes where you could put up a problem and you could see how each student was working out the problem, but now they're starting to see it used in a number of other places. So I encourage you to check out some of these. Also check with your district. A lot of times they're paying for tech tools and you have no idea that that's happening. And you can also help influence what their contracts might be as they go forward if it's something you really want to use. Again, also, if you haven't played around too much with Zoom, there is a way to do polls, and I didn't launch this opening poll, so right now seems like a great time to do that as an example of how we could use things like Zoom's internal features. So you should be able to click as many of these as you'd like. So many of you are probably a classroom teacher and a CTE teacher, because if you're a CTE teacher, you're a classroom teacher. And I was just looking to see if we have a little bit of both of non-CTE folks here, counselor, community partner, industry partner. It looks like everybody who's voted so far is in the high school side. So this is a quick way for me to get an overview. Using something like this is also great for SEL. When you are looking at social emotional learning and ways to check in with your students, using tools like this that are anonymous are a great way to kind of check in with your students and also get context for what they're doing. If all of your students are having a rough day, that is a formative assessment. Maybe you can reevaluate like the level of intensity of your plans for that day. If a lot of students are just struggling, you might say like, hey, we're gonna scrap this one thing we were gonna do and instead spend time on doing something else. Checking in to see like, hey, how much of your anxiety that you're holding right now has to do with my class. It might help you to kind of reevaluate and get feedback from your students. So this is just a little poll that you can use in order to see what is happening. And I can share my results, or I can choose not to share my results. So I'm sharing the results with you, and you should be able to see now, and you can scroll a little bit down if you want, although no one is in middle or elementary today, what everyone's role is and what they bring to the table. So that is one way to kind of do a formative assessment. So I also am curious if there's anything else that you're using that I didn't throw into that small amount to check for understanding with your students, or if one of the things that I didn't point out is something that you really love. So it looks like Roxanne is using Jamboard. Jamboard is kind of a new tool with Google that is interactive whiteboard. I have not played around with it myself, but it sounds like a lot of people are really jamming on the Jamboard. And again, if you are just joining us, the link to these slides is right here, and it's at the bottom of these slides. And we are also recording, and so we will have that at the end. Like Padlet button, Google Apps, great. That's helpful for me to kind of have that piece. So the next thing I want to ask is, how do I close the gap, right? So we said, where am I going? Where am I now? And how do I close the gap? So how are we putting this data to work? So I just want you to be thoughtful that if you're not the only one who needs to use that data. So you're going to use that data to inform instruction, but also to inform students of their progress. And you don't have to give your students all the data, but really be thoughtful about what will help them progress forward, because that student role is something we forget a lot of the time. We think about our role in formative assessment because formative assessment informs our practice, but it also informs what our students are going to do next. So these are like self-assessment, peer assessment, and teacher feedback. And so, like I said earlier, with those rubrics, you can actually have students, you can put them into smaller breakout rooms or assign partners where they have to go and assess each other's work. A lot of learning management systems will even allow you to assign feedback to another student in the class, anonymously or not. And so that's something that you can explore depending on your learning management system, is having cycles of peer assessment that are virtual. So instead of going to class right now, you could be assessing somebody else and not actually have to be in these synchronous learning environments all the time. I'm just looking at the chat here. Great. Roxanne is really excited about Jamboard, giving peer feedback, using it with the digital Post-its, and so that students could put their project out. I don't know, Roxanne, do you want to share a little bit about how you're using Jamboard for peer assessment?
Sure. So we just started doing it and it was really kind of cool. So what we did is I also have a student teacher. So he modeled like a sample project. So he put his on the Jamboard first. And then we talked about how to use like a sandwiching approach kind of to give peer feedback. So then students all put Post-its kind of on his board and we created 3 copies of his board. So then his project. So then not everybody was working on the same frame because otherwise it would get too busy with Post-its. And then we had students went into breakout rooms where they were sharing their projects with other students and getting feedback. But then once they chose or selected a few students that should have their board maybe shared with the whole class, those boards, we then had the students put them on the Jamboard. And then we came back as a whole class and students were putting Post-its showing which parts, they had to use like 4 different principles of design. So they could use the sticky to show whether or not they were looking at contrast or whether they were looking like the way that students were using repetition or alignment or proximity, and then the color combinations that students were using. And this was a bio board project. So some of them used Photoshop to do it in, but some of them used Google Drawings or Canva. And then once they had everything on their board, they put the board out there and there were various requirements that they had to do for this bio board. But I thought it was very successful and it worked really well and students seemed very engaged.
I like how you're using a model first, because when you get into feedback cycles, students are really hesitant to give quality feedback. That's a really important thing, and they also hesitate to give critical feedback because they don't want to hurt feelings or things like that. So if you as a teacher can model that it's okay to fail or be wrong or get feedback that's critical, right? But also give students, it's not like, hey, like I hate this, or it's not really rude comments, but like how do you give meaningful feedback is a piece of that puzzle. And so having that systemic approach to providing that feedback is important. And so this can be written or oral. It doesn't need to be graded either, right? And so that's a really good example of where you can have these Post-its that go on, you have feedback from a number of different folks.
And then students afterwards, just to kind of follow up, they were able to take that feedback and work on revisions. So then when they're posting, you get to kind of see the progress. So you see the original board and then you see like their revisions with, the next step. And then once they submit it, then the instructors are going to be kind of looking at it and giving additional feedback. And then there's opportunities for, further revisions. So it's kind of this ongoing.
Yeah, and that's really important. And so even if we look back, there was the page that I had around the life-changing rubric, and that cycle of feedback and continued work. When we talk about meaningful work and assessment, what we want to do is we want to change what it means to be done with something. Okay, traditionally, we say, here's your assignment, it's due on this day, they turn it in, and they never work on it again. We have all of these great things where we get a panel of industry partners to watch their presentation and give feedback, and they get the feedback and they do nothing with it. And so what you want to do is create ways where it's part of your classroom culture to get feedback, use it, and come back around to it. When I was in the classroom, I had a policy that I will pre-grade, but I won't regrade assignments, and it got students in this habit of doing their work ahead of time, bringing it to me, and I would grade it, I'd tell them what they would have gotten, I'd give them all the feedback, and then they turn it in and their friends would go, not that, but they'd revise it, and when they turn it in and they get an A, their friends go like, how did you get an A? Which, like, unfortunately, some kids look at kids like that, but maybe like, I got it pre-graded. And so by building a culture of having something done early and getting feedback, it really changed students and what their mindset looked like on getting their work done. There's a few resources I have for feedback. One model I wanted to open and show you is called RISE. And so this is just one model that you can use so that students kind of have prompts for the feedback they're doing. So first might be reflect, to say like, oh, wow, so far this is what I see, I'm pondering and thinking about. To inquire, ask additional questions. To suggest, wow, based on what you have here, I think you should make these changes. And then elevate. if you were going to make this bigger, here are some things I suggest for you. So what I did here is I actually built a little Padlet. And so I think you could easily use this with Jamboard or other processes. And let me make this a bit bigger. And you all can actually join this Padlet if you would like. And if you wanted to give feedback on my presentation so far, then you can just add straight into this around my experience. So if you had a Jamboard for different students or a Padlet, then you could go through and say like, oh, I've already had lots of great things in the chat that fit right into this feedback, right? You're giving me feedback as we go. So you might say like, suggest, talk more about 1 point versus multi-column rubrics. So if you haven't used Padlet, which hopefully you've had a chance to do that, if I could spell it right, that would be even better. Oh, and here we go, Socratic Seminar. So these are things like you can have students just add to their own project. Like they could each have a digital board like Padlet or Jamboard, or even something as simple as a Google Doc, and other students could add their little sticky notes in it. When you're using Padlet in the classroom, you can have all the students logged in so that their comments are not anonymous, because we know that sometimes anonymous comments can be dangerous. So this is a suggestion here of one way that you might be able to use this. And if you haven't played with Padlet, it's really fun because you can drag things around to say like, oh, if you want, actually this was an elevate, or this is a reflection, or whatever it is. So this is a really easy way to work with your students. But in the sense of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on here and talk more about how and when will students demonstrate mastery, because that's what we think about when we think about, if you came here thinking about assessment, how am I going to put this in the grade book at the end of the unit? These are all things that we want to think about. So there's a lot of different kinds of outcomes we're looking for in our class. We might want them to recall facts, understand concepts, apply knowledge to solve problems, analyze information, design and produce products, or perform a process. And there's all kinds of additional outcomes, particularly in CTE, around skills and things. Now, when we give a test, like a plain old multiple choice free response assessment, that's something that you can do to assess these top 4 categories. But when we look a little bit closer and create authentic learning experiences and performance assessments, we can get to much more rigorous levels of understanding of where our students are and what they can do. And so really, I'm encouraging you to not feel like you're boxed into creating tests and coming up with how to do test security in a virtual environment and all of that. The one place you might see that is in certification, but luckily, we're not the ones figuring that out. The certifying companies are, right? And so as we get into this, I really encourage you to think performance assessment. So let's look at a slew, I think I have 9 different categories of assessments that you might be able to use. So first, projects. Real world challenges through project-based learning. Like I said earlier, if you can design a rubric and it says, okay, at the end of week 1, here are the areas of the rubric we're gonna try to self-evaluate. And you can keep going through the process so that at the end, they have reevaluated earlier parts of the rubric a number of times. They're building on their project as they go. That's what project-based learning is. But you also can have unique opportunities to do authentic exhibitions. And so because everyone's at home right now, you can have a whole bunch of people in a Zoom watching a student's final presentation, but you can also create online places for all of the students learning to live. I've seen a really cool thing using Padlet, where each student's, there's a notepad for each student, or a note for each student with like the image of the assignment that they had. So I think someone was using it for a photography assignment. And so what you ended up with was a giant gallery, because each sticky note on Padlet, if you look at it, I can actually add an image to it as well. So I can attach something to it, I could add a photo. So it ended up this huge gallery of student work. And because you can add a link, that link could actually be the entry point into that project for that student. And so you can create a student exhibition with something as simple as Padlet, where there's one single place where each student's work has a launch point and a link and an image, and then you can link into that and get in to see what else they have. So you can be really creative with what virtual exhibitions look like. I think that digital portfolios are one of the most underused things in all of education, but particularly in career technical education. We see them in some places and not in others. Right now is a great time to jump into portfolios, and exciting at our Go Virtual Career Pathways Conference that's going to be October 14th and 15th. We do have a session on digital portfolios, so if you really want to dig into that, you might want to attend. And a side note, because of technology and the need to not have like limited access to people who have paid, we decided it's going to be free for everyone, not just San Diego County. So Go Virtual Career Pathways Conference is now free for everyone. We will probably limit out of county folks to like 500, but right now I think there's less than 20. So so jump in on that. The Go Virtual, I have a link to that at the end here. Anyway, so check out the portfolio session that's coming up there. Giving students a chance, if you've ever looked at process portfolios, it's not just a showcase of final work, but a showcase of the process to get there. What you can do is you can look through those non-negotiable learning outcomes that you've put together and have a portfolio piece for each one, where students can showcase their learning as well as their final understanding of it. Design is a huge foundation of nearly all the things that we do. It's not just for arts, media, entertainment, although they do a lot of really visual design, but having students do 3D designs, diagrams, blueprints, infographics, marketing campaigns, animation, other visual, anything visual is a great way for students to show their learning. And so have them create designs, and in that design, right, you create that rubric that really outlines how those align to the standards. Scenarios and simulations. A lot of simulations are a little bit difficult to put students through without, I know it costs money to purchase online simulation programs, but also like there's a great, I know for automotive, there are some that are a cost, but it's something that we can do from home is have students go through simulations. But you can also write up scenarios. So writing up a client request and making that your student assignment would be great. I know when in order for me to get my administrative credential, the scenarios were incredibly difficult. I tested for my administrative credential instead of taking the coursework. And so they gave me a scenario and it took 2 hours to respond to 15 pages of data. You're a new principal at a school. What would you do? That's the question. They give you 15 pages of data about this fake school. They say, you're a new principal, what would you do? 2 hours of intense writing as fast as I could. And there was more I could have shared. And so how do we replicate that for our students? Give them some data that has something to do with like a fake company or something like that. And then you can go forward with that, right? So the scenarios and simulations are helpful. Obviously, presentations are huge. You can have them give their own mini webinars or TED Talks. All of these are digital these days. You can have them pre-record or you can do them live. So many options for that. Incorporating writing, but when you think about having your students do writing as an assessment, think about what writing exists in your industry, okay? It doesn't, like how many people do a 5-paragraph essay for a job? Teachers, maybe, you know what I mean? So really think about like, is your industry have reports or journal articles or just news articles, right? Emails, respond to emails, send memos, and then also give them opportunities to journal about their work, progress, and growth. These are all things that you can do as assessments. Creating case studies, and apologies, I know I'm going a little bit over. It will all be recorded and we're almost to the end. Hopefully you have the slides and you can pop through the rest. So thinking about case studies, giving them real world situations and have them do an analysis. What went right? what went wrong, what went, were there certain strategies incorporated that you've learned about in class, so that they can kind of analyze it after the case. Audio and video. Have students create podcasts. Oh, that's another session at Go Virtual. There's one on how to create your own podcasts. This is all a secret. We're going to release all of these sessions next week. So I'm very excited. We have, I think, 36 sessions for educators as well as a student strand that we are working on. So excited for all of that. So if you want to know more about podcasting with your students, you can check that out. I also think that giving them an industry video and having them like sportscast over it, and now they put on their welding mask and it is going to block out all of the light that's a certain wavelength to protect their eyes, right? So these kinds of things are really helpful. And obviously, industry recognized certifications. This depends on your sector and what's available virtually, but these are all things that your students could work on from home. So I put together this graphic, and if you click on it, it opens separately just as a reminder, and I'll be kind of pushing this around because authentic assessment is really important in distance learning and outside of distance learning. I have a few slides here on instructional strategies for all learners and really being thoughtful about scaffolding and strategies. So I didn't go into stuff that you would normally do in assessment, but I just wanted to remind you, know your students, not just who has legal accommodations like an IEP or 504, or who needs language accommodations, but also accommodate at-home learning and technology barriers. Some days my internet stops working and some days it's great. And so these are all part of accommodating our students. They also might have a family where there's 7 people who are all trying to use the internet at the same time, and that can be a big barrier. Build opportunities for individualized support, but don't make kids come to you. Sometimes if you have office hours or even non-office hours, schedule meetings, particularly with those students who need additional support, so they can check in with you, ask questions, so you can model some of the expected outcomes, or maybe just say like, hey, I want to have a meeting with you so I can pre-grade your work and give you some feedback before the final assessment. These are all great ways to support students with special needs, or just any student that you see who may need a little extra help. A few just reminders in a virtual environment. There's a lot of accessibility options online. You can just zoom in on a page, you can use Google Translate, but if students haven't been trained in doing these, they're going to be lost. So intentionally train students how to use these tools. You yourself need to understand accessibility. Guess what? That's another session at the Go Virtual Conference. I swear to you, this is not an advertisement webinar, but hopefully deeper learning will continue to happen. Think about alternative assignments or different ways to do assignments. If all of your students are being asked to do a live presentation, you might give some of your students the opportunity to do a pre-recorded one if they have an IEP and they might just want a little bit of a lower pressure environment. And also talk to your students. How can I help you do this better? What extra accommodations do you need? Great, choice boards, exactly. That is definitely one of the things that you can do. Choice board helps give more choice. And I didn't even talk about choice. I talk about it in all of my lesson planning webinars though. So this is great. All right, so next steps. We have a gazillion resources on our website, and that's also where this recording will end up. So I know I'm scheduled to do a website update tomorrow afternoon, so I should be able to put the recording up then. Sign up for our newsletter, join the CTE Instructors Network. Many of you are part of that already. And that just means that you don't have to sign up for these opportunities. I just drop them onto your calendar. And then if you can attend, then you attend, but it's easier to plan around them when I have a webinar or we have a monthly meetup or things like that, if it's already on your calendar. Join us at the conference. Like I said, it's going to be offered now at no cost for anyone. That way I don't have to figure out how to limit access to those of you who pay. And so we're looking forward to that. Statewide, if you're not already attending the CTE webinar series, there's links to those sessions here. The CTE listserv, if you email this website with a blank email, then it should add you to the list to get the statewide updates and sign up to join CTE online for all. They are also pushing out a ton of great updates along the way. So I will Sometimes people like to have proof that they attended. So now would be your opportunity to take a screenshot. I made up a certificate. So hopefully that's helpful for some of you if you're coming from a place where you turn in things like attendance on professional development because you have spent an hour, and I'm really hopeful that this was helpful to you. And so what I would also like to do is give you my final poll because it is also helpful for me to have feedback so I can form my next one. So I would appreciate if you can take this final poll, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to stick around, ask them in the chat, ask them with your voice. But thank you all for attending, and we will see you at the next one and hopefully at the conference.